Hello and welcome back to another episode of About Abortion with me, Beth Davey. Now today it's just going to be me and I'm going to be reviewing a documentary that I watched recently at the weekend. We as a church hosted this screening of the 1916 project by Seth Gruber from the White Rose Resistance. It's currently streaming for free as of recording this episode over on X, which is formerly known as Twitter. You don't need to have a Twitter account to be able to watch it. I watched it without having a Twitter account. And what I'm going to say is basically, I really highly recommend that people go and watch this because the information that's in this documentary is incredibly interesting and enlightening. It's also been published as a book. It's called the 1916 Project. The subtitle is The Lion, the Witch, and the War We're In. But first, let me give you an overview of the documentary, the film itself, in which we watched. The book has a lot more information. So if you're interested from the documentary, go over and get the book as well. But the film itself has a tagline which states, "The 1916 Project is a documentary that exposes the hidden history of the secular moral revolution and the architects of our current culture of death." So the big question that they're seeking to answer in this documentary is the culture of death that we're in right now. How did we get here? Its roots have to come from somewhere. It didn't just begin from nowhere. How did we get here? And they do this by following the development of one person in particular, Margaret Sanger, who founded what is currently known as Planned Parenthood. So they look at her philosophical, her ideological influences. They look at key moments in her life. They look at particular projects that she championed. And then finally, they look at the connection between her movement, the Birth Control League, the Planned Parenthood movement, and Nazi Germany. Now, you may not realize that Sanger and her colleagues actually so impressed Hitler with their writings, their thoughts, their ideas, that they became the foundations upon which Hitler and his colleagues based the final solution. Now, how does a birth control movement so impress Hitler that it actually influences Hitler's next steps? Well, what they do is they look at the logical outworkings of the ideas, the philosophies that Sanger and her colleagues based their whole movement upon. And just because the Nazi regime took those thoughts to their logical conclusion a lot quicker, and actually that he made the Sanger and her colleagues jealous by how quickly they were able to implement a lot of these things that they themselves had been talking about, discussing, thinking through, and yet failed to put into action. They were a lot slower. They were taking their time, and Hitler made them jealous in how quickly he was able to put them into effect. But just because their movement was a lot slower and Hitler's was a lot quicker, just because their movement has a lot more support from liberal feminism, from the sexual revolution, the same bad ideas that founded the current abortion movement, they're not only tolerated, whereas Hitler's are almost universally condemned, but they're rampantly celebrated. And they're the ones behind this current culture of death. So that, in a nutshell, is the documentary. And it really was a very well-researched and well-produced documentary that really brings to light these deeds of darkness that the current secular culture, they don't want to admit. They don't want to admit that their patron saint, Margaret Sanger, actually so influenced Hitler that he based his actions upon their writings, their thoughts, their ideas. They don't want to admit that their patron saint actually was a eugenicist who wanted to eliminate the Black population. Now, maybe they'll quietly remove her name from streets or from squares in New York City. Maybe they will quietly put a caveat on their website that, yes, Sanger did support this eugenicist bill or did support the enforced sterilization of certain people groups. But they try and keep that quiet because what she achieved, they love. What Gruber calls the sacrament of the liberal establishment, abortion. Now, if you can, I would really recommend that you host a movie night at your church, that you screen this film at your church. They're doing free screenings for churches, even if it's not available on X for you to watch there, because it really highlights the evil foundations, the demonic foundations of our current culture of death. Even if this is going on in America, America has a huge influence on the rest of the world. And so it's not just a case of, well, that's America, we're in the UK, it's not relevant to us. What's going on in America, what happened in America hugely influenced the UK and vice versa. So I think it's incredibly important that churches first recognize the evil roots of our current culture of death, that we're able to see where this came from so that we can firstly strategically pray against these forces of darkness, pray against these powers and these principalities, but also to wake up the church that has maybe been asleep for so long. Maybe there are people in your church who say that they are pro-life, but they don't actually know where the current culture of death has come from. Maybe it's important for them to, first of all, find out, have a look at the research, hear what these people who have researched and spent so long looking into this have uncovered, have discovered about where this has come from. But then Gruber doesn't leave it there. He challenges people. Now you know, what are you going to do about it? And so I think this is a real important message for the church. Firstly, not to bury their head in the sand, not to just ignore the reality, ignore the facts of history, but to find out where this has come from. And then secondly, to take action, to be the church and to stand up against the evil that is driving this culture of death. So Seth Gruber, along with Dr. George Grant, he is Sanger's biographer. In this film, they trace the influences in the timeline, as I said, of Sanger's life, and they uncover the evil roots of the birth control movement, which has paved the way to child sacrifice that we have in our present day. And the first thing, I'm going to draw out a few things from this film. I'm not going to go into more detail because I really want you to go and listen, watch the film for yourself, read the book for yourself. But I'm just going to draw out a few things that they touch on, but don't go too deep into. And the first thing I want to highlight here is the very phrase itself, birth control. So this phrase, birth control, it was coined by Sanger, but it's now such a ubiquitous term. It's so accepted in our modern culture that we don't even really think twice about women being on the pill, women using birth control. It's just such a everyday phrase that when people say birth control, you don't think about it. But the very phrase itself, birth control, it reveals some of the intentions within the movement that Sanger was a part of. The desire to control birth. That's what fueled her first illegal clinic that she started in 1916. And the desire to control birth is still at the heart of the abortion industry today. We control the birth of those that we deem unfit, as Sanger explicitly said. Though we wouldn't put it in such vulgar terms, we wouldn't say that we're trying to control the birth of the unfit. We still have laws that allow for abortion up to birth if our child has an extra chromosomal abnormality such as Down syndrome, or if our child might have a cleft palate or a club foot. These unfit, we still try and control their births.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of About Abortion. I hope you're appreciating these podcasts. And if you are, can I ask for your help? in getting these vital messages to more people. We're delighted that we can get these to people free of charge, but that's not free for us to produce. It costs something like £300 to £400 a month to get these podcasts produced. And I wonder if you could help us, partner with us financially. Many of us will have an Amazon Prime subscription or some kind of streaming platform to the tune of £6, £7, £8 a month. I wonder if you consider, as it were, taking out a subscription with us. If you could donate, say, £8 a month, if we had about 40 people donating around £8 a month, just £8 a month, that would help us to continue to do these podcasts free of charge for anyone who wants to listen in. And this is the only podcast specifically about abortion in the UK. It's the greatest injustice, not only of our time, but in all history. Would you help us to bring these life-saving messages to more people? And don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Do send this in particular to your church leaders and anyone else you think might be interested. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll let you get back to the episode now.
Sanger explicitly said that what she saw as the greatest sin that anyone could commit was allowing people to be born who were mentally unwell, who were from rough families, who were from thieving or immoral families, any of these people that she deemed unfit. She said that that was the greatest sin in the world. Now, as I said, we don't use those explicit terms. We are not as upfront about our agenda, and yet we are still trying to eliminate those who are unfit. We might change the terms. We might talk about compassion and mercy. Oh, it's not compassionate to bring a child with a disability into the world. Isn't it more merciful to kill them than to let them live? But the same spirit of eugenics is behind the birth control movement of yesterday and today. But this isn't the only way in which we try to control birth, because our desire to control birth also comes from limiting procreation. And again, Sanger believed that sexual equality and the fulfillment of women in the sexual act, it required controlling female fertility in order to prevent children. That the only way to have marital fulfillment and sexual fulfillment is to separate the act from bearing the children. And is that not what we see again today? Female sexual liberation requires the detachment of procreation from the act of sex, and therefore it demands that women control birth, that they control their reproduction. And so hence abortion has been renamed reproductive rights. We allow our sexual appetites to control us. And so we take mastery over the consequences that may arise from allowing those sexual appetites to control us. And so we control birth, either to eliminate those we deem unfit, or to take our own sexual liberation and detach it from the God-given blessing of children that was to come from the marital act between one man, one woman in covenant marriage relationship. And so both these ways in which we control birth, both these ways, they fly contrary to what we see in Scripture, don't we? The very idea of trying to control birth, control the blessing that God has given to man and woman, control the purpose for which sex was created, for the begetting of children in marriage. And as soon as we take these things away, and as soon as we take it into our head that we are the ones who will decide who is fit and who is unfit for life, whose life is valuable and whose lives are life unworthy of living. As soon as we take these things into our own hands, sex and children, value and life, we take them out of the authority and will of God, and we make ourselves the authority of good and evil, we declare, my will be done rather than thy will be done. And so Sanger, in this film, we see Sanger really normalized the subversion of God's authority and God's will, so that even today, the church won't stop and think about what it means for Christ to be Lord over all areas of life, including this area of our lives, including our children, including our fertility. What if we took these things out of our own control, out of our own hands, and actually submitted them to Jesus? What if we said, no, I'm not going to control this. I'm not going to limit the blessings. I'm not going to take this into my own authority. I'm not going to try and do my own will in this area, but I'm going to allow, Lord, thy will be done. I hope to maybe spend some more time on this topic in the future, but just for now, I think it's sufficient to say that we need to really think carefully about the roots of birth control before we blindly accept and eat of its fruit. Because I think it's one of these areas that we've walked into without really thinking. Again, the church at the time didn't put up a fight. It was illegal for Sanger to be talking and promoting some of these things, but not because of the moral. It was not because of what the church had to say, not because of what scripture had to say, not because of what God had to say, but because it was deemed inappropriate. It was deemed that it was of an inappropriate nature to be publishing these things. And so again, the church really failed in its area to take things back to scripture. What does God have to say about sexuality, bearing of children, about the marital relationship? What does God have to say about fertility and birth? And I think this is an area that we need to continue to think seriously about, particularly today when there are so many people on the pill, birth control pill, so many people seeking IVF and trying again to take birth into their own control. So this is something that I really want to talk about at a later date, but I think it's very interesting to notice the correlation between where this idea came from and how it's seeped into our culture today in a way that we don't even recognize, we fail to pay attention to, but actually it's permeated every aspect of our culture and accepted in a way that we need to take a step back and think this through a bit more. Now, the second thing I want to bring your attention to is that Gruber and Grant discuss some of the publications that Sanger wrote. As I mentioned earlier, she was almost arrested for some of these publications within a magazine. But I just want to consider the title of the magazine that she wrote as well. Her first magazine that she published was called The Woman Rebel. Now, that may not stand out to you immediately. You may be thinking, so what, how is the woman rebel that important? But we know from scripture, don't we, that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. And I'm sure that Sanger wasn't overtly identifying herself as a witch. Maybe not so much as people today, where witchcraft again is having a surge in popularity, and paganism is once again kind of rearing its head. But think back through history. How often has witchcraft been associated with women who used herbs or other methods in order to prevent children or even induce a miscarriage or an early abortion? Think about it. The association between witchcraft and abortion is highlighted throughout history, even going back to the New Testament times, where Tim, elsewhere on this podcast, he's talked about that term pharmakeia. which we see in the New Testament, which according to Strong's Greek refers to the administering of drugs, poisons, sorcery, and magic arts. There's a correlation here between these drugs, these poisons, these things that we take, and witchcraft. And so I don't think it's any surprise that Sanger names her magazine The Woman Rebel. As I said, she may not have been overtly identifying herself as a witch, but we see the spirit behind the movement, the spirit that's been operating for millennia in coming against God's mandate to have children. It's rearing once again its thinly veiled head. And I don't think it's any surprise either that this rebellion against God that Sanger forged went the same way of all idolatry. The tagline for her magazine, The Woman Rebel, was "No gods, no masters," effectively making herself and every individual master and God of their own lives. And so this rebellion is as witchcraft because it's the same as any idolatry throughout history. Any force that puts itself up in opposition against God, it went the same way as all idolatry. And Gruber traces the same steps as well. He says it starts with the denigration of the pinnacle of God's creation, humanity, bringing humanity down onto the same level of creation, or raising creation up to the same level as humanity. And then it leads to sexual chaos. And then sexual chaos leads to child sacrifice. And so in calling her publication The Woman Rebel, we can see the rebellion against God. We can see the connection with witchcraft that has so long held connections to abortion. And just tracing that similarity throughout history, it's no surprise when we get to Sanger. Now, you may be thinking, it's very well to hear the unsavory roots of Margaret Sanger, of Planned Parenthood, how they were involved with Nazi regime and Hitler, but what does that have to do with us here in the UK? Well, I hope that you'll have seen that some of these ideas that they're talking about will have some connection for us. So birth control, it's not just limited to America, but we have it here as well. Things like the connection between witchcraft. Again, in the UK, we have a huge history of witchcraft in this nation. And witchcraft, as I said earlier, is once again becoming more and more popular with the rise of things like witch talk. But even around Britain today, paganism is coming back once again in full force. But Margaret Sanger particularly, what does she have to do with the UK? Well, there's one aspect of her life that they go into in a little bit of detail, but I want to just kind of pinpoint that and dive in a bit more than Gruber and Grant go into. So when Sanger published her magazine, The Woman Rebel, she was indicted for writing, for publishing writing that was of an obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, and indecent character. And as they went out to try and arrest her, she flees from America to escape arrest. And she comes to the UK. And they just very briefly touch on this. But it's what happens while she was in the UK that has significant impact for us, I think. And I might go into this a bit more in another episode as well. But it's while she's in the UK that Sanger speaks at a Neo-Malthusian. That's a meeting that's based on the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who is an Anglican priest in the late 18th century, who saw the increasing population and was concerned that population increase would soon outstrip the production of resources, and hence was the first person to really have a concern for overpopulation and therefore turned to eugenical ideas in order to control the population so that the population wouldn't outstrip resources. And this is something that we still see today, don't we? So many times when you're having conversations with people about abortion, one of the things that they'll bring up is that we're overpopulated, that we don't have enough resources, or taken from a different direction, the climate crisis people, they will say that humanity is the problem, that we are the ones destroying the environment, destroying the resources, being selfish and sinful in continuing to have children. And so we need to do something about that. And so today we have, antenatal movements where people are vehemently against having children because of what it does to the earth. And these ideas really began in the late 18th century with this man, with this Anglican priest, Thomas Malthus. And it's very interesting that until we get to Nazi Germany in the documentary, this is really the only mention of contemporary church. And the sad thing is, the church was the seedbed of these bad ideas. So Sanger's in the UK, and she's at this Neo-Malthusian conference, and she's speaking at this Neo-Malthusian conference, and she's talking about her ideas on birth control. And who is in the congregation, who's in the audience but Mary Stopes? Now, you may not have really heard of the name Mary Stopes. I think if you're in the UK, you should have heard of the name Mary Stopes. It should be familiar to us, but largely it's not. Now, Mary Stopes is to the UK what Margaret Sanger was to the US. She is running in the same circles as Margaret Sanger. They're being influenced by the same men, by the same philosophies. At the time, they were aware of, going forward from this anyway, they were aware of each other's works. They respected the work of each other. And so I think it's quite important that in recognizing the roots and influences of Margaret Sanger, as this documentary details, we can then better understand the same ideas that were influencing the birth control and abortion movement here in the UK, as they're in the same spheres of influence. They're not operating in isolation, but they're being formed and shaped by the same bad ideas. And as Gruber says, bad ideas have victims. So let's come on to these victims. The future generations of Americans and Britons, the unborn of our nations. What really stood out to me in this documentary was that both Seth Gruber and Dr. George Grant describe how they first became involved in the pro-life movement, kind of the origin stories without which we wouldn't have this research, we wouldn't have the resources that they've put together, we wouldn't have the movements that they've created to stand up against the culture of death. And they both reveal how it was seeing the reality of abortion which was the key to mobilize them to action. As I said, this really stood out to me in the film. They are exposing the roots of evil, but if someone had not exposed the reality of the fruit of this evil to them through abortion imagery, neither Gruber nor Grant would have taken this stand against the culture of death. They would probably have just continued happily ignorant about the reality of what was taking place in their nation and on their watch. Yes, Gruber talks about how his mother was part of a pregnancy resource centre and he was pro-life, but he says it wasn't until at the age of 18 he saw mutilated, aborted babies, that was the moment that the cause became his own. Seeing what abortion does to its victims was the turning point for Gruber, and now he has dedicated his entire life to waking up the church to the injustice that abortion is, to calling the church to take up her role in today's culture war. And so it's so important not only to expose the deeds of darkness through the roots and ideologies, but actually through showing this is what you are championing. This is choice. This is reproductive justice. With the hands and the feet and the jaws and the intestines of the victims. This is so important. And how many more people are like Gruber or Grant? People who will be mobilized and stirred to action and make a real impact in the culture today if they could just see what this injustice does. So, as I said at the beginning, this is a really excellent documentary. It's filled with important research, filled with important connections that we need to be aware of in the pro-life movement, wherever we are located. But this documentary is not just information. It's a call to action. You'll see if you watch the documentary or if you read the book, the undeniable connection between the birth control and abortion movement and Adolf Hitler. So the question for us today comes back to the same as in Nazi Germany. It's Christian resistance. We see the heroes and the heroines of the Second World War, Christians who had the courage to stand for truth even when it cost them everything. Willing to stand for the truth regardless of the consequences. Well, if you want to know how you would have responded to Adolf Hitler, just look at yourself today. How are you responding to the greatest injustice of our day, of abortion? It's got the same roots, the same ideologies, the same demonic influences behind it. But this time it's got an even greater grip on culture. And Gruber highlights this. We need Christian resistance still. And the film quotes from Sophie Scholl, the Christian student and martyr of the Second World War. She said, "We are Christian and we are German. Therefore, we are responsible for Germany." Well, I put it to you, we are Christian and we are British. Therefore, we are responsible for Great Britain. You see, it's not enough to just be pro-life in conviction. We need to take action. We need to be the church. We need to be willing to stand for truth regardless of the consequences. And we need to be building a culture of life in the growing culture of death. One of the ways that you can do this is to go over to CBRUK/join and join the movement today and expose the injustice of abortion in your area. You can host a viewing of the 1916 Project, buy a copy of the book, go into some of the background behind these things. But let me finish with this question that Gruber ends his documentary with as well. If not you, who? And if not now, when?